Part 2 of Factorial Designs, I want to begin going over the different types of designs that fall under this umbrella of factorial designs. And I think the best way to do it really is to look at actual research articles that use these different types of designs, because they really highlight how these designs are created, how they're gathering data, and what they can teach us. It's not incredibly vital that as you read an article, oh, this is a single factor design with one dependent variable and so on. However, I think it's helpful to understand the design because it tells you how the subjects were treated, how they were assigned to groups, the strength of the statistical tests that are being utilized, and so on. So I think it's good to kind of understand how these different designs may be created. Now, I know most of us are not going to be doing research ourselves. We're going to be reading research, but it's still helpful to understand some of these concepts so that we can better understand the articles that we read. So let's take a look at some examples. But first, let me introduce this idea of single factor designs. So in between group single factor designs, we're going to see a couple things here. Now, remember, we talked about between and within subjects groups, or between group and within group designs in the previous unit. But between group designs are where the subjects are divided among the different treatments. So each subject gets only one treatment, versus, again, within subjects or repeated measure designs, we see each subject is subjected to each treatment. So, in between group designs, we have subjects that are going to be randomly assigned to the treatment groups, probably in a counterbalanced fashion. We want to keep males and females about equal in each of the groups, potentially. We may want to, if we're working with a specific team type, we might want to have some of each position in each group. So there may be counterbalancing in terms of this random assignment to groups. At times, the groups might already exist, so we don't actually assign them, but we're comparing men to women, or we're comparing forwards to defensemen or defense players in soccer, or we're comparing offensive players to defensive players in football, and so on. But these groups typically either are going to be randomly assigned or they're pre-existing. In a single factor design, only one factor is studied, right? So we're only looking at one group or one factor. So if that factor is gender, that's the only factor we're looking at, and we would have two levels of gender, just male and female, which would make it not a factorial design because we need to have more than two groups, or we need to have more than two levels to make this a factorial design. So there could be one factor such as position. Let's say we're looking at soccer players. We could have one factor, and that's position. And then we could have multiple levels, which could be midfielders, forwards, and defense players. Or we could even subdivide it, center midfielders, wings, center defenders, defenders that play on either side of the field, and so on. But again, we would have three or more levels of that one factor if we're looking at a study that's comparing, again, using a between group single factor design. The statistical test that's used in a single factor design is a one-way Anova. And again, when we see differences between the groups, if we look at sprint speed among the different soccer positions, we're going to see differences between the different players. However, we would use an Anova to see if those differences are real, or are they likely to just be due to random variability. So an example of this would be, we want to look at three different types of foam rolling. So maybe we're looking at three different treatments. We're going to look at treatment A, which is foam rolling with a vibrating foam roller. Treatment B, which is foam rolling with a non-vibrating foam roller. And treatment C, which is a control, which is no foam rolling. So again, that would be one factor with three levels. And again, we could then conduct our study. Maybe we're measuring range of motion after the foam rolling. An Anova could be conducted to compare those differences in those three different treatment groups. And maybe the Anova returns a p-value of 0.03, which is less than 0.05, which would tell us that one of these treatments is different from another. So again, if we had 3 different range of motion measures and so on, Anova returns a significant p-value. That tells us one of those treatments, at least, is different from one of the other. What the researchers would then do is use t-tests to compare A to B, treatment A to C, treatment B to C, and see which ones were actually different. Okay? So again, that's just an example of a single factor between group design. So each subject in the study only would be in one of those treatment groups. Here's an example from the literature. All right, let's look at the title first. And this would be an example of a between group single factor design that utilizes an Anova. So we have sprint activities and distance covered by top level Europa League soccer players. Okay, so what they were doing here, let's focus on the distance covered. They wanted to look and see various soccer positions in this league. Do the different positions run different distances, right? So that'd be interesting for me if I'm trying to design an exercise program, a training program for these individuals. I need to know how far do they run in a given competition because I'm going to utilize that information when I'm designing my training program. So really kind of a practical study. So what they did was they studied these soccer players and they measured by watching film, I believe, they measured how far each of these different positions ran during a soccer season on these various teams. So this is the distance covered in meters in the first half of a match, second half of a match, and overall. And let's just look overall. So these are the external defenders, this first column. They ran this far. The center defenders ran this far. And we can see that there were differences in all of the different positions, right? With the average soccer player in this league running about 11,000 meters in a given game. We see that the external defenders ran further than the central defenders. The central midfielders ran slightly more than the external midfielders, but very similar. And then the forwards ran, about 11,000. So we see that the defenders ran on average maybe less than the midfielders. But the questions would be, is that difference significant? And that would be what we would be studying in this type of a study. So this is an example of a between group because each of the subjects only was in one of the groups, so all of the external defenders only were in that column, all of the central defenders, and so on. And we then compared those mean scores to one another. The findings are interesting, and the findings are listed here, and these are the significant findings. So the central midfielders ran the most, followed by the external defenders, followed by the forwards. There was no difference between the forwards and the central defenders. The central defenders ran less than the external midfielders. So we can see again that there were differences between these groups, which might mean that we want to train them slightly differently. This article is another example of a between group single factor design. So in this study, which is titled The Training Effects of Foam Rolling on Core Strength Endurance, Balance, Muscle Performance, and Range of Motion, the authors had a group of subjects and randomly assigned them to one of 3 different treatment groups. We had a foam rolling treatment or training group. We had a core strength training group, and then a control group that did, I believe, basically nothing. That's the group you wanted to be in, right? But those were the 3 different groups. So a particular subject was randomly assigned to one of those groups. That's what makes this a between group study, because each subject was in only one of the treatments. Over the time of this treatment, subjects were measured pre and post in a variety of measures. The fact that they were measured on multiple dependent variables, which included core strength endurance, which there were 3 subtests in that category, muscle performance, again 2 subtests, a balance test, and a range of motion test. Because there were multiple dependent variables, again, we put these people into a training program and measured the changes in their performance in what is it, 5, 6, 7 different measures, tests of performance. So that makes it a, again, single factor because we only looked at treatment as one independent variable, but we had multiple dependent variables. So it's like the soccer study that we just looked at, although they measured multiple dependent variables, which makes this, instead of an Anova, it makes us a Manova, which stands for multiple analysis of multivariate analysis of variance, meaning that there were multiple dependent variables. So again, really interesting study because they found that the foam rolling group performed differently than the core strengthening group and the control group in a variety of measures. I'm going to include these articles for you all if you want to read further and kind of look at what these may be. Again, they are kind of interesting studies. Again, they're always kind of neat findings, whether you're interested in some of these topics or not.